Nice to connect with you. So your question is a bit about myself. My name is Bhakti, and I am at the moment based in Bangalore in India, but I'm actually an Australian citizen. I moved to Australia 25 years ago, and I'm a water. I worked a lot in the field of water management and waste and sustainability, working mainly with the local city councils and water utilities, doing sustainability programs, policies, and strategies. Yeah, and I've got about, I've worked in this water sector for over 20 years.
Were you on the side of the water utility or more like the municipality side?
So initially, I have worked as a consultant and advising water utilities in designing some sustainability programs. Then I've also worked from the inside the utility, and same goes with the city councils. Earlier, I was a consultant working outside the city councils, but then I've also got a chance to work from the inside the city council.
Excellent, excellent. So plenty of experience with water utilities and local government.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, now I have a special question. What water was the first water that you drank? The water that you grew up drinking, basically. Where did it come from?
Okay, I grew up. Most of my years of my growing up were in Bombay city, and in Bombay we got water from surface water. There's a dam, and so it was a surface water treated and supplied to our homes. But the water supply wasn't 24 hours. It used to be intermittent, few hours in the morning. So we used to actually store water in many containers, and my mother's was one of those, very, very particular about getting up in the morning, early in the morning, filling up a lot of pots and big pots and small pots and everything. And the worst part, which when I reflect back, was next day you would throw any water that was stored and fill up again. So
Oh wow. Just be as precaution, right?
yes, and because there was a feeling that it's old water and it's not fresh water, so you need to. But yeah,
What was the reservoir name or what was the lake name?
good question. I didn't do my homework. It's been.
Don't worry,
I forget the name.
We'll find it.
Yeah, I'll find and send it to you.
And okay, so what made your water job unique?
I think it is unique in the sense that it's a job. I worked in the strategy area, which means it was a newly created role, even within the city council, where they were looking at how to embed sustainable water thinking within their business, not as a separate thing, but how to embed it rather than do it as a separate project. And in the same way, in the utility sector, I mean, when I worked for the water utility, my job was also, it's a newly created role about developing long-term water strategy or asset strategies to service long-term needs of the community, and what would a water utility be doing in the long term, and keeping that in mind, how do you plan, how do you make your investments today? So that was the unique part, is about long-term thinking is only a new, it's a new element in the organization, because it is usually has been a maximum 5-year thinking, not a very long-term view.
And so doing that type of work, you must have really had to focus as well on the different types of pressures that water management is facing.
That's right.
Do you think water utilities do enough of that?
Yeah. So I think it's a challenge, because what happens is the reason I think it's easier to plan for 5 years is because you can. It's easier to know what's happening in 1 year now currently. But when you start to extend the time horizon, it's a lot of uncertainties. So even the process of planning is very challenging, because the other factor is that most utilities are, have traditionally been engineers who are very used to more certain numbers. They need to know exactly what number, what quantity, what's the size of the problem. So given that type of culture, and as it is, even for non anybody, it is hard to imagine the future, right? What is going to happen? So there are very specific processes that allow you to create scenarios, and create plausible scenarios, and there is a method to it, but it's a very newly emerging method and processes, and new and emerging for the utility sector. They are not used to it, but they are slowly learning. But even then, it is not easy to learn, because you have to unlearn before you learn, so to speak. That's where most utilities, I think, are. They understand that we need to plan for a longer term horizon, looking at there's so many things happening. Climate change, the technology is changing, the climate is changing, the community expectations are changing. So the changes are happening at multiple dimensions, and to make sense of that is challenging. However, there are some tools and processes that you could use in order to look at that long term thing, and that's where most utilities are learning those tools, and how do we actually look at the future and make sense of it, to be able to then bring it back to today. So one thing is to imagine the future, and then the next part is to how do you make sense, and what do you do today, and what do you don't do today. So that is where the learning process is. And as I said, that learning process, most of it involves unlearning and giving up your current way of planning and current way of making sense. And so I think
That's a tough challenge.
yes,
A very tough challenge. It's a change in mindset more than anything, isn't it?
yes, correct. And it's easier said than done. Easier said than done.
For sure. And do you think there are any particular changes that utilities should make in order to relieve the stresses of raising water issues?
Yes, I think there's a lot that can be done, and as you say, becoming more, because they have been very regulatory driven, and that is another thing, is that we have to recognize why is the culture so at the moment the way it is, because there's a reason for it. They have been very much regulatory driven, which means staying within the rules was the only aim, and staying under the radar, not really. If you're not being talked about, that's a great achievement, and really keeping a low profile, and just dealing with the key issues on a day-to-day basis. And now suddenly they are expected to look at customer centric. That means you understand what the community is wanting, and also the regulation expects them to be consumer centric, which is a big shift. So what could be done is become more good at engaging with the community, and being actually more involved in understanding and involving them. Again, because that becomes a challenge, because they have been very risk averse in communicating to the community, because anything could become an issue, or it could suddenly flare up, and how do you deal with it? So, but I think they have to start to develop that capability of engaging in a very meaningful, very systematic way with the community, and also sharing their challenges, because often communities don't really understand how much goes into producing a drinking water, how much goes into dealing with their wastewater. So I think that would be a good start to actually engage with the community in a very constructive and meaningful way, and in an open way as well.
That's what I've been thinking for the past 2-3 years, that the only relationship we have today with water is the water that comes out our tap, but we have no idea how that water comes to our tap. And just putting a bit more transparency on that highlights all the complications behind water management and the ones that utilities are facing. Let me go back to the consumer-centric approach to water management. What does that mean exactly, and what type of consumers do you think should be the bigger focus?
So when we say consumer, actually I prefer the term community because I know, but because we pay for water, we kind of become the consumer or the customer. More the language that the utilities use is customer because it's more about who's paying for water, which is fair enough. But when it comes to engagement, it is more important to, I think in terms of the groups of customers or the community, because water is a very it's a social, it can be a social binder, and it's a social common factor. So it's important to understand what the community as a whole, as a collective, think about water and get them to understand that. So the way, so what does it mean for the utilities to look at in how could you involve your consumer or the customer in your way of planning for the future. For example, how could you understand what is it that they value? And for example, it's not just about water, but what kind of services are important to the customer in the future. For example, it's we know that the cities are growing, and as cities grow, more and more concrete structures are coming up, which means it is leading to a lot of urban heat island effect, right? So there's a lot of heat generated now, and there's a very lack of space for greens, vegetation. So if the community is not going to say we want water to do this, but what they can express is that we would like more cooler spaces, like green spaces. Now, understanding that's what the community wants, how can water play that part, its part in servicing that? So at the moment, what happens is water utility only deals with water coming through your taps inside the home. So are you getting water in your taps? Are we taking the sewage out of your premise? But then there's so much more water does in the wider community outside the individual apartments or houses. So trying to understand that the community would like recreation. Now, how can water contribute to that recreation space, right? So it is trying to understand the community aspirations and needs, and then seeing where does water fit within that is a way to really understand role of water within and becoming consumer centric.
Do you think the industrial sector should also be a focus of the consumer community centric approach to water management that utilities are taking?
Yes, absolutely, because the water utility services the people, the businesses, the industries within the city. So having understood or seeing what's possible with the community, then you also try and understand what's happening in the industry, the commercial operations, right?
Yeah.
So the growth of the industry, what is expected in the next 5, 10, 15 years, and that's where the most difficult part is. Because it's very hard to predict, how the industries are going to grow. So it's also in terms of a risk. You need to understand what industries will prevail, what may not exist, and that will start to paint different scenarios.
And also the fact that the main aim for an industry obviously is growth and revenue, and for that to happen, I mean, I guess they need more raw materials, and they consider water as one of those raw materials. So there's probably always a growing demand for water resources from their part.
If you're looking at what utility as a business, then what you would try and do is to understand their predicaments, in predicaments of the industry, and what water security means for their business.
What other types of changes do you think water utilities should make in their business models in order to better understand and adapt to the evolving water cycle today?
First of all, the business model needs to be driven by the fact going to be imperative, more and more imperative in the future. So what that means is that how is your business model today? It will adapt itself better and more, and it is actually transitioning towards a circular economy. Now, what does that mean for water?
Yeah.
So what that means is currently the way the water supply chain or the disposal chain works is that you draw water out of a source, you consume it, you take this wastewater and dump it in another place. So it's basically a linear approach. And now to move towards a circular economy would mean that you actually attempt to reverse that and to take the circular approach at different levels. You could take it at an apartment building level. You could take and utility taking the responsibility to facilitate that circular economy servicing through water is what that could be done to prepare your business model. So your business model should be created around that you are actually actively helping an apartment building how they could actually recycle, how they could generate water on site. So at the moment it's left to the individual apartment buildings, right? So you could be actively helping the utility, the apartment, you could be helping a new development to create those opportunities because it can be done at so many different levels.
Exactly.
And how can a water utility provide that? Because the fact is, most people are not knowledgeable enough to make those type of decisions. They don't even have the control.
That's true. It's true. It's true. So you see the water utility giving such a service.
Being the facilitator.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you, as a water utility, can enable that, then create a service around it.
Yeah.
And create your business models around that.
I can definitely see it being done at the household level, at the apartment building level, at the neighborhood level, at the city level. Very interesting point.
Yeah.
And do you think that there are particular technologies that water utilities should embrace as well? Say like new technologies that are more trending these days?
Sure. So I look at technology as a means to achieving a certain objective. So I don't think the utilities need to be tied up to certain technologies.
Okay.
They should be more tied up to achieving the service objective, right? Which is how could I make sure that I'm trying to recycle better, I'm trying to reuse better at different levels. So then that way, then anything that fits the purpose or fits the objective, it could be a very low-tech approach, it could be a high-tech approach, it doesn't matter, but it should be the technology or any solution should be more contextualized.
Yeah.
It should be more suited to the context. So it has to be contextualized. So I wouldn't like to pin on certain technologies.
Yeah.
It is more on keeping the focus on the service objective, and anything that suits the context should be the solution.
Okay, which is a very valid point. So now we're gonna move on to more like idealistic question. 50 years from now, what would you say would be the most ideal water utility?
Right. I mean, it doesn't have to be 50 years from now. It could be done if there's an intention.
Exactly.
In 10 years, we could do that.
Exactly.
Yes. So I think the approach. So an ideal water utility would be, engage with the community at the watershed level, for example. So they would look at their whole service area based on the water catchment. Right? Okay. And then engage the community to help them understand what that water catchment is. It's a very collaborative approach. And also, I would
And it's also part of our mission to raise awareness on such topics.
Water awareness is so badly needed. In fact, that's what has driven me to create this training I have created recently, and I'm doing in India, is water audit training, which is about getting people to audit water in their own apartment.
Yeah.
Because that starts to educate them about their own, how does the water get used, how does it come, where does it go, and then you start to make decisions, more informed decisions.
Definitely. Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time here. Let me just ask you one last question. What would be one message you'd like to leave for future water professionals?
Well, I would say that water is a resource that is actually available in plenty but highly mismanaged. How to manage it is what has made it come to a point where it has become unsustainable.
Yeah.
So as long as you make sure that you're governing and managing water well, you have water security.
Okay, Bhakti, well, thank you so much for participating and taking time off to answer such questions.